Hey everybody, it's Julia Kavanaugh and
I'm Nancy Ham.
welcome to Postpartum Perspectives, the place to come to hear all things newborn care and postpartum related.
We hope you enjoy the following podcast.
All right, so you're ready to really dig into this whole vaccines and autism thing? We've got some interesting stuff to look at today.
Yeah, sounds like it.
3 articles, all from The Defender, which is funded by readers, no corporate sponsors there.
Okay.
They're all about a study that found a link between vaccinations and autism. Then a review that's pretty critical of the CDC's take on it, their stance. And then we'll get into the whole aluminum adjuvant thing.
Okay, so kind of covering all the bases.
Yeah. This first article, it jumps right in with this study, claims that vaccinated kids have 170% higher risk of autism than kids who aren't vaccinated.
Wow, 170%. That's pretty significant.
Yeah, it means they're almost like 3 times more likely to get diagnosed.
Makes you wonder if it's a small study or something.
No, not at all. It's peer-reviewed, published in Science, Public Health Policy, and the Law, and they looked at like a massive amount of data.
Oh,
Over 47,000 9-year-old kids, all from Florida, and they were part of the Medicaid program since they were born. So the researchers had all their medical records.
interesting. So did they find anything else? Or was it just autism?
They found a 212% higher chance of other neurodevelopmental issues in vaccinated kids, too.
Oh, wow. Like what kind of issues?
Things like ADHD, epilepsy, learning disabilities.
Huh, so pretty broad range then.
Yeah.
What were the researchers thinking going in?
The lead guy, Anthony Mawson, he thought maybe it was the whole childhood vaccination schedule itself causing problems,
Oh, interesting.
especially since they keep adding more and more vaccines to it.
Yeah.
And he also thought that, preterm babies, they're more fragile, so they might be even more at risk from vaccinations.
That makes sense. I mean, it makes you wonder if they proved that.
Well, they found that the risk of all these neurodevelopmental problems, it kept going up as the number of doctor visits with vaccinations increased. And yeah, for preterm babies, the risks were even crazier. Like they had a 612% higher chance of brain inflammation
Oh, wow.
and an 884% higher risk of learning disabilities compared to preterm babies who weren't vaccinated.
Those are some pretty serious numbers. Like if they're right, that's a big deal.
I know, right? Makes you wonder, since autism rates have gone up so much in the last few decades, if maybe the CDC keeps adding more vaccines and that's part of the problem.
Yeah,
It's definitely something to think about.
for sure.
This article even quotes this epidemiologist, Nicholas Holscher, and he calls for a complete overhaul of what he calls the CDC's hyper-vaccination schedule.
Wow, so he's not holding back at all.
Nope. It's like maybe it is just too much for a little kid system to handle.
Yeah, definitely worth looking into. I mean, not just if each vaccine is safe on its own, but like what happens when you put them all together?
Right, exactly. And speaking of the CDC, this next article, it's all about a review that really criticizes their whole stance on this issue. So let's see what they have to say.
So this next article, it's about this review, and they're basically saying that the CDC's claim that vaccines don't cause autism, it's like built on shaky ground.
They're not just questioning the research itself, they're questioning like the CDC's whole position.
Yeah, pretty much. One of their main criticisms is that the CDC hasn't really done any big studies on the connection between vaccines and autism, except for like little studies on the MMR vaccine and thimerosal, that preservative they used to use.
That seems kind of weird, right?
Yeah,
I mean, if they're so sure about it, you'd think they'd want to like prove it, with some good research.
exactly. The review authors also call them out for relying on these reviews from the Institute of Medicine, but they say those reviews don't actually rule out a connection. They're saying the CDC is kind of picking and choosing what they want to believe.
Okay, so what about those studies you hear about all the time? The ones that say vaccines don't cause autism, like the ones that are always in the news.
Yeah, the review talks about those too. Specifically, this big Danish study from 2019.
Okay, yeah, I remember that one.
Everyone was saying it was proof that the MMR vaccine doesn't cause autism, but the review authors point out some problems with the way they did the study.
Oh, like what kind of problems?
Well, one thing is they didn't include kids who were diagnosed with certain genetic disorders when they were babies. And the review authors say those disorders could be like risk factors,
Yeah.
and they should have been included.
So they kind of left out some kids who might have been more likely to have problems.
Exactly. And then there's this thing called healthy user bias.
Healthy user bias.
It means that, like, If your first kid had autism after the MMR vaccine, you might not want to give the MMR to your other kids, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
But then that makes the MMR look safer than it really is because the kids who might have a problem are left out of the data.
Oh, I see what you mean. So it's kind of like a rigged game.
Yeah, kinda. And then, of course, there's the whole conflict of interest thing. They found out that the Danish study was funded by groups that have ties to the pharmaceutical industry. Like, one of the funders owns a big chunk of a huge drug company.
Right. And drug companies obviously want everyone to think vaccines are safe. So did they influence the study? I mean, it's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely suspicious.
Totally. And it's not just this one study. The review authors say this is a big problem in vaccine research in general. Like, if you want to study if vaccines are safe, it's really hard to get funding, and it's hard to get your research published.
Oh, wow. So it's like they're trying to silence anyone who disagrees with them?
Pretty much, and that's why it's so important to have independent researchers and publications like The Defender, to keep things honest.
For sure. So this next article, it goes deep into this ingredient in a lot of vaccines, aluminum adjuvant, and how it's been linked to autism.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. They're saying that there are 5 big scientific discoveries that point to a connection between vaccines and autism, and it all comes back to this aluminum adjuvant.
Okay, so before we get into those discoveries, can you remind me what aluminum adjuvant is and why people are so worried about it?
Sure, it's basically a thing they add to vaccines to make them work better. It's supposed to, rev up your immune system so it reacts more strongly to the vaccine.
Right.
The problem is, the amount of aluminum that kids get from vaccines has gone way up in the last few decades.
How much we're talking?
In the 80s, a kid would have gotten around 1,250 micrograms by the time they were 18 months old.
Okay.
But now, it's almost 5,000. That's 4 times as much.
Wow, that's a huge increase. And do they know if that's safe?
Well, that's the thing. There's not much research on the safety of aluminum adjuvants, especially for babies. Their brains are still developing.
Right.
The FDA and CDC say it's fine because it goes into your bones and then slowly leaves your body.
Okay.
But that's based on studies of aluminum that's already dissolved, not the aluminum hydroxide they actually use in vaccines.
So it's like they're not looking at the right kind of aluminum?
Exactly. And newer research has shown that this aluminum hydroxide, it can actually travel all over your body, even to your brain, carried by your immune system cells.
Oh, that's not good. So what does the research say about aluminum in the brain? What does it do?
There are some studies that have found some pretty scary stuff. These scientists in Canada, Chris Shaw and Lucica Tomjanovich, they've shown that aluminum adjuvant is a neurotoxin.
A neurotoxin. That doesn't sound good at all.
Nope. They found that it can kill motor neurons and cause autoimmune reactions. And there's research from France that shows that when you inject aluminum adjuvant, it can end up in the brain and cause problems. And one study even found that getting small doses over and over again was actually worse than getting one big dose, which is kind of scary considering how many vaccines kids get.
Yeah, that is pretty scary. So it sounds like the science is saying that this aluminum adjuvant is not as safe as they're making it out to be. Okay, so let's get into those 5 scientific discoveries that show a link between vaccines and autism. What's the first one?
The first one has to do with this idea of permanent immune system activation in the brains of people with autism.
Okay, so what does that even mean? How does your immune system mess with your brain in a way that could cause autism?
Right. So there was this really important scientist, Dr. Paul Patterson. He worked at Caltech. He did all this research on how a pregnant mom's immune system can affect her baby's brain development, especially if her immune system is really active, if she has a bad infection or something.
So if a pregnant woman gets sick, it could mess up her baby's brain.
That's what his research showed. And then the question is, well, what about vaccines? Because vaccines are supposed to make your immune system react, right? So could they be causing this same kind of immune activation in pregnant women and causing problems for the baby?
That's a pretty disturbing thought.
Yeah. And Patterson and his team, they actually found signs of inflammation in the brains of people with autism, which means that this kind of immune activation had happened. And they were able to cause the same inflammation in mice by injecting them with this thing called IL-6.
IL-6, what's that?
It's basically a signal molecule that tells your body to start inflammation.
Okay.
And they've done studies on mice and monkeys where they caused this immune activation in the mom, and the babies ended up with autism-like symptoms. So it's starting to look like all these pieces fit together.
It's scary to think that we might be giving pregnant women vaccines that could be harming their babies.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
What about the second discovery?
The second one is all about how aluminum adjuvant is a neurotoxin. We talked about some of the research on that already, but they're saying that the FDA and CDC are using old science to justify using aluminum in vaccines.
Yeah, they're saying it just stays in the bones, but we know that's not true.
Right. And they point out that the kind of aluminum in vaccines, this aluminum hydroxide, it's so small that it can get absorbed and travel all over your body, including your brain.
Makes sense.
They even mention studies that show aluminum building up in the brains of people with autism,
Wow.
and that aluminum causes inflammation and other problems.
So that's two discoveries that really point to this aluminum adjuvant being a problem. What about the third one?
This one's about when this immune activation happens. They're saying it can happen before the baby's born or after, as long as the brain's still developing. So there's a pretty big window where the kid could be vulnerable.
So it's not just what happens during pregnancy, but also the first few years of life.
Exactly. And they say there's good evidence that things that happen after the baby's born can trigger autism. They explain that every time a kid's immune system gets activated, it can become more sensitive and reactive.
So like a snowball effect.
Yeah, kinda. And they talk about studies where they injected baby mice with IL-6, and they ended up with problems with learning and memory later on. There are also stories of kids who developed autism after getting infections or brain inflammation, so that supports the idea that things that happen after birth can be a problem.
It makes you wonder, kids are exposed to so much in those first few years, not just vaccines, but also germs, pollution, even stress. It's a lot for their little brains to handle.
Totally. It really makes you think about how all those things might be working together.
Okay, so what's the fourth discovery?
This one's about the hepatitis B vaccine.
Okay.
They found that this vaccine, which has aluminum adjuvant in it, caused an increase in IL-6 in the hippocampus of rats.
The hippocampus.
It's the part of the brain that's really important for learning and memory.
Oh, okay. So we're seeing that same IL-6 connection again, but this time with a specific vaccine.
Exactly. And here's the weird thing. They didn't see the effects of the vaccine until the rats were 8 weeks old, which is like almost fully grown for a rat.
Wait, so the problems didn't show up right away? That's scary because they usually only test vaccines for a short time to see if they're safe.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if we're missing some long-term effects that don't show up for years or maybe even decades.
That's a terrifying thought.
It really makes you think we need to be doing much better safety testing on these vaccines.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, last one. What's the fifth discovery?
The fifth one goes back to aluminum. They're saying that lots of analyses have found high levels of aluminum in the brains of people with autism.
So that kind of ties everything together, right?
Yeah.
We know aluminum can get to the brain. We know it's toxic. And
Yeah.
now we know it's in the brains of people with autism.
Yep. And they're arguing that this buildup of aluminum, along with the immune system activation we've been talking about, explains how vaccines could be triggering autism in some kids.
Okay, but what about the MMR vaccine? That one doesn't have aluminum in it.
Yeah.
So how could that be linked to autism?
That's a good question. They think that even though the MMR doesn't have aluminum, it could still be a problem for kids who've already gotten aluminum from other vaccines.
I'm not sure I follow.
Okay, so the MMR is the first vaccine that kids get that has a live virus in it.
Right.
And they're saying that this live virus could be too much for an immune system that's already been messed up by aluminum from other vaccines.
So the aluminum primes the immune system to overreact, and then the MMR is like the final straw.
Exactly. It's like the immune system is already on edge, and then the MMR pushes it over the edge.
Wow. What really gets to me is all these parents who say their kids regressed into autism after getting vaccinated. I know people say those are just anecdotes, but it's like, how many anecdotes do you need before you start taking it seriously?
I know, right? It's like these parents are with their kids every day. They see what's happening. We need to listen to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And the author ends by saying that the CDC, FDA, and everyone else needs to wake up and see that there's real evidence here. They need to investigate this properly.
It's a call for them to be honest and accountable. We need to stop arguing and start working together to figure this out.
It's definitely a lot to think about. It's like scary, but also, hopefully we can get some answers.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like you said, all those parents, they're seeing something, right?
Right, exactly. So where do we go from here? Like, after all this, what are the biggest questions that we still need to answer?
Well, one thing is, how exactly does this aluminum adjuvant thing, how does it mess with the immune system in the brain? We know it's toxic, but what's actually happening in the cells?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And why are some kids, more sensitive to it than others?
Right, exactly. Is it genes, something in the environment. We need to figure out who's most at risk.
Yeah. And I feel like the CDC and the FDA, they need to be more honest about the risks of vaccines. They're so busy telling everyone to get vaccinated that they don't want to even talk about the bad stuff.
Yeah, I agree. If there's even a tiny chance that some vaccines, or maybe the whole schedule, is causing these problems, they need to say so. And then we can, figure out what to do about it.
Totally. It's like all this secrecy just makes people distrust them even more.
Yeah.
If they want people to trust vaccines, they need to be honest about what we know and what we don't know.
For sure. Transparency is super important.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, it's up to the parents to decide whether to vaccinate or not.
Right.
They need all the information, good and bad, so they can make the best choice for their kids. And they need to be able to talk to their doctor and ask questions without feeling stupid.
Absolutely. It's their right to make an informed decision.
Well, this has been a really intense deep dive. I feel like I've learned a lot, but it also opens up a whole bunch of new questions.
Yeah, that's how it always goes, right?
I guess so. So to everyone listening, this is just the start. Keep researching, keep learning, and keep talking about this. It's super important.
Definitely. The more we know, the better decisions we can make.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep learning and keep questioning.